welcome all. Good evening. I'm pleased to see so many here. This is a public lecture on a very small nation in the North Atlantic, so I appreciate the interest. I will start with some personal remarks, not personal, professional remarks. And the reason for choosing this title, the Arcticification. When I was planning the lecture, I thought that I would also refer to some of my personal experiences lately. For about 5 or 10 years ago, when I received emails in my mailbox, most of them were about Scandinavia, the Nordic countries, literature, and so forth. Then emails started reaching me about the Arctic, and they just increased. A lot of researchers, academics, and other people from the outside world were interested in having me participating in different networks about the Arctic region. Now this was new to me, and what is happening is actually that the discussions about the Arctic today are dominating, I think, very much about the development of politics and research in our area. And it's a dramatic change, so I want to include that also in my presentation this evening. I was at a conference in Copenhagen 1 month ago, just to illustrate the difference. When we meet academics who are interested in literature, we usually meet for a couple of days for a seminar or something. We discuss literature or poetry, and when that is over, we go out and we have a couple of beers or something, and then maybe a year later or 2 years later, a book or something else is published with our contributions from the seminar. When I participated at a conference which was multidisciplinary in Copenhagen 1 month ago about the Arctic, suddenly there were people participating in military uniforms. So you see, this is in a whole new context and a new way of looking at our region when we use the term Arctic instead of the terms Scandinavia and Nordic. I didn't know exactly which audience I would meet tonight, so I have some basic facts to begin with. This, of course, is the capital of the Faroe Islands. You can see something of the harbor there, and this would be a typical picture from April, for instance, because light has returned to the northern regions. It's still cold, so you can experience snow, but also sunshine. It's a bit like New York the other day, I think 2 days ago, with sun and windy and very cold. So typical picture from April. This is the geographical location of the Faroe Islands, in the middle between the British Isles and Norway and Iceland. And we have very close historical connections to Denmark. It's important to show this also because the Faroe Islands, as the name says, are islands. And the advantage of being an island is that you have very clear boundaries. If the Faroe Islands were a small community on the European mainland, maybe the boundaries would have changed because of wars or whatnot. But when you are islands in the ocean, you have the boundaries that you have, and you have them for centuries. And at the same time, you can see that the Faroe Islands are quite isolated, but we are not that isolated, so we have also had continuous contact, external contacts with our neighbors. And some of our neighbors have been very powerful. I mean, the UK at least, they used to be very powerful, and today they still are, at least culturally, they are a powerful nation. Norway is very rich and prosperous and so forth. So that has also had an influence on the way that the Faroe Islands have developed through centuries. This is the population presently. We are at the moment more than 55,000 people on the Faroe Islands, and there have never been more people on the Faroe Islands than now. It's worth mentioning this because a lot of, or many at least, island communities have experienced a loss in population in the course of the 20th century. The population of the Faroe Islands has increased since the beginning of the 19th century, so for about 200 years. from around 5,000 people in the year 1800 till 55,000 today. And this is a picture from a festival that is held every summer in the Faroe Islands. At the moment, at least, life is good on the Faroe Islands. I would almost say it's hedonistic. We are enjoying life. It's because of mainly two factors. There are two major industries on the Faroe Islands, salmon farming and fisheries. Fisheries around the Faroe Islands and also elsewhere. And both industries have been doing very well for the last 15-20 years. So there has been economic growth, and we are also experiencing a lot of interest from tourists. So we have a growing tourist industry as well. And a lot of investments are made into new hotels, but also infrastructure. A lot of new restaurants are popping up everywhere. And people, well, generally are enjoying themselves at the moment. So this is a typical picture from a Faroese festival in the summer period. This is in July every month, this festival. Let's dig a little deeper into Faroese history. I would like to quote here an American scholar who has been to the Faroes several times, or at least 2 times. Her name is Karen Osland. And she writes in a book about the Faroe Islands. It's called Iceland Imagined, but it is about the entire region in the North Atlantic. And she says here that there was a belief in a European imaginary geography of the North Atlantic that was well established by the late 19th century. The farther north one traveled from the European continent, the less recognizable the world became. The North Atlantic was a zone of change. So it was a sort of a mysterious place. It was at the edge of Europe to many travelers. They traveled to the north, and when they reached the Faroe Islands, they considered themselves to have reached an area where things still were European, but not that European. So there were some things that were known to them, there were other things that were completely unknown to them on the islands. And also notice the term she is using, imaginative geography, and this means that when we experience something that is unknown to us, it's based both on our experiences but also on what we imagine. So people also imagine different things about the North, and they had this from stories and texts and books going back for centuries. So when they traveled to the north, they had these images with them, their own images of what the North was about. And this is important again today concerning the Arctic. Old stories, old narratives are resurfacing in the discussions about the Arctic today. And I like to quote another one. This is an American, Jonathan Wiley, an anthropologist who visited the Faroe Islands several times and wrote books about the Faroe Islands. And I like this very much. This is a bookish observation he is making. So the Faroes are an obscure corner of Scandinavia. They are a Danish dependency, but internally self-governing and culturally distinct. My own discovery began in 1970. My first discovery was the well-stocked shelves of H.N. Jacobsen's bookstore in Tórshavn. There were a great many literary and historical works. Literature and historiography were evidently thriving in the Faroes. So instead of looking at the nature and ocean and birds and whatever people are looking for on the Faroe Islands, he goes into a bookstore and looks, what are people writing here? And it's a little bit of an eye-opener also to a Faroese to read that it's true. We publish, most of the books that are published on the Faroe Islands are books of history or literature. And there are some historical explanations for that, and you will see that later on in my lecture. And we still tend to publish a lot of books about history, memoirs, and literature, poetry especially. If you go to a bookstore here, for instance, you will see a lot of books about business, leadership, economy, psychology, whatever. Very few books about that are published in the Faroe Islands. We read them in English or Danish. Books in Faroese are, as Jonathan Wiley noted already in 1970, literature and history mostly. I will say something about the history of the Faroe Islands just to give you an overview. We do not know so much about the first settlements in the Faroe Islands. Archaeologists have revealed that the first settlements in the Faroe Islands were around the year 500. We also have a written record from the year 1825. An Irish monk is writing in a book about geography that there are some islands to the north of the British Isles, and they are all separated by narrow stretches of water. And he also mentions that they are now settled by Norse Vikings, but before the Vikings arrived, there were some Irish monks there. And these Irish monks were looking for solitude. Whether they were driven away by the Vikings, or whether they just decided to move because the Vikings arrived, we don't know exactly, but we know that at least some of the place names on the Faroe Islands, they have Irish Celtic origin. So there must have some sort of communication between the Irish to the south and the Norse Vikings coming from the east to the Faroe Islands. The Vikings who settled in the Faroe Islands, they organized themselves as they had done in Norway. They had a parliament, and the parliament was on that rocky headland you can see on the picture to the right. That's in Tórshavn. They had an outdoor parliament, and it was also the high court, so people were judged there, were sentenced there. There were close connections to Norway, and eventually the Faroe Islands came under Norwegian law and also had to pay taxes to the Norwegian king. And what happened was, with the great importance for the history of the Faroe Islands, was that in 1380 the Faroe Islands were included in the Danish kingdom because the Danish and royal families and the Norwegian royal families, there were marriages in between them, so the Danes inherited the Norwegian kingdom. And when Norway became a part of Denmark, the Faroe Islands followed. Another important event here early in the history of the Faroe Islands is around year 1000 the Faroe Islands are Christianized. And that's by initiative of a Norwegian king. So, and here we come to a very important issue in the Faroes, which is the language. We can see from sources that the Old Norse language that the settlers spoke developed slowly into some sort of Faroese in the late 15th century. We can see that from some documents. But at the same time, Danish became predominant. So we were part of the Danish kingdom, and most of our contacts eventually went through Denmark. And the officials on the Faroe Islands were Danes, most of them, and slowly, especially with the Reformation, Danish became the dominant language on the Faroe Islands. In many countries, the Reformation led to a shift from Latin to the native language, or vernacular language, the native tongue in the language of the country. But in the Faroe Islands, it was a shift from Latin to Danish. Faroese then became the vernacular language, the language that people use among themselves, at home, or in daily communication. So we had two languages in the Faroes, the official Danish language and the vernacular Faroese language, spoken by around 4,000 or 5,000 people. In 1800, we know that there are around 5,000 people on the Faroe Islands. At the same time, something very important to Faroese history happens in Europe, and that is the Romantic movement. With the Romantic movement, there was growing interest in old traditions, old languages, and the roots of the cultures in Europe. And this benefited the Faroe Islands because there were a lot of academics in Denmark and elsewhere who suddenly gained an interest in Faroese matters, Faroese language, the grammar of the Faroese language, the old ballads, stories, and so forth. This led to a culture of manuscripts, you could say, or collecting. In Scandinavia, also in northern parts of Germany, a lot of academics took initiative to collect material from the Faroe Islands because they saw in it some old parts also of early European culture. So they were interested in this, so people on the Faroe Islands started collecting material, ballads and stories, pieces of stories and all the things that were distinct to Faroese culture. They were writing them down, collecting them, sending them abroad to academics in Copenhagen or elsewhere who were interested in doing investigations into these things. And an interesting example is the Faroe saga that you can buy today, which is a saga about the early settlements in the Faroe Islands, especially the Christianization of the Faroe Islands in the year 2000. It actually didn't exist as a single manuscript or a single book. It was found in pieces, bits and pieces in other Icelandic manuscripts. There had been a Faroe saga, but it was lost. So the scholars in the 19th century, they compiled all these bits and pieces from different other manuscripts and made it into the Faroe saga, which is actually quite a good text, and some call it a very fine piece of literature in pieces. So, and it's a text that became an identity marker, you could say, for the national movement in the Faroe Islands in the 19th century. Other texts and ballads from the period were also published in 1822, for instance. Faroese ballads were published for the first time in a book. What happens is that the vernacular language of the Faroe Islands and the culture that had existed only among people, orally, became published in books. And we slowly were approaching, you could say, a modern written culture in the Faroes. It's also important to note here that at this early stage, every publication of Faroese text had some Danish explanations around it, because these were scholars elsewhere who wanted to understand a culture that had, or a place where they had preserved an ancient culture. So they had introductions and notes and so forth in Danish in the first publication, but then slowly they were only in Faroese. And maybe I should note also that the Faroese ballads are based on some of the same stories, early Germanic stories that are to be found in the Nibelungenlied with the German, which inspired a lot of musicians and for instance Wagner and so forth in Germany. But it's the same old stories from the early Middle Ages, and they are believed to have been composed, or these sagas, now ballads, are from the late Middle Ages, maybe 12 or 1300 or something, and then published here. And I can show you some of the young Faroese artists of today are inspired by this material. So you could say what happens in the 19th century is a revival or a reconstruction of an old oral culture and literature. And these young artists, again, today, are not just reproducing it, they are interpreting it in a new context, and are doing it very successfully. So this is all based on, you can say, on the romantic revival of the Faroese culture in the 19th century. So a very usual way of interpreting Faroese history is like this. As you can see, there's something wrong with it. Well, this is supposed to be, home, away home, almost like a fairy tale. So many people on the Faroe Islands, and this is a very usual way of interpreting Faroese history, is that in the Middle Ages we spoke Faroese or Old Norse. We had the ballads from the Middle Ages and told legends and so forth. We call it legends today. And that happened the unification with Denmark, the Reformation, and later Royal Danish trade monopoly. For 300 years, the official culture of the Faroe Islands was Danish. Then, with the Romantic movement in the 19th century, we were, or on our way back home, you might say, we developed a new Faroese orthography. Poems were published, and novels, history books, and so forth. And as you will see later, we had a referendum in 1946 on Faroese independence. Then a Home Rule Act from 1948, and sort of a nation-building process, you can say, began in the 20th century. So, but of course, this is a simplification. This is not quite true, actually. In the middle, a lot of things happened, although the official culture was Danish. There was a theater in Tórshavn, for instance. There were Faroese students in Copenhagen. Some of them were publishing poems, and some of them were also writing scholarly works and so forth. But of course, it was in a different language, and everything that happened on the Faroe Islands actually happened in Copenhagen. So this is a way of looking at the development, but with some. You have to take some consideration that, of course, some things also happened in the middle, of course. A lot of the debate, both politically and publicly in the Faroe Islands in the 20th century, was about language. Language and literature as things that were identifying for the Faroese society in general. And you can see here, this is a picture typically staged as some Faroese writers from the 20th century. A photograph taken in Tórshavn, but it could be in Paris almost. Some of the most famous writers from the 20th century. What you can see here are two things are happening at the same time. Many people, most of the novels that were written in the Faroe Islands in the first half of the 20th century were written in Danish. Most of them were written in Danish. And many of them were very successful internationally. Now I'll show you this picture here of Barbara. This is the most famous novel from the Faroe Islands in the first half of the 20th century. It's written by Jørgen Frans Jacobsen, the one you can see with the pipe in his mouth there. But at the same time, as some writers were doing very well internationally, writing in Danish, there was a struggle for the recognition of the Faroese language as a language of literature. So there were other novelists and writers who insisted on writing Faroese. And they wanted to prove that the Faroese language was not only a language of daily communication, but also a language of high culture, a language for intellectual debate and so forth. And the person to the left, farthest to the left here, he published poems in 1914 that were influenced by European symbolism, and they combined that with some of the uniqueness of Faroese culture. He also translated the Iliad into Faroese, which you can see here to the right, in order to prove that the Faroe Islands, or the language of the Faroe Islands, also could convey some of the finest examples of European literature. So this was an important struggle, you might say, and there's important debates in the beginning of the 20th century. And then this happens. Second World War broke out, and the Faroe Islands were lucky enough to be occupied by the British. Denmark was invaded by Germany on the 9th of April, and people on the Faroe Islands were shocked, of course. Norway was also invaded, and there was a general belief that the German occupying forces were on their way to the Faroe Islands. People on the Faroe Islands could see Royal Air Force circling around the Faroe Islands as if they were looking for maybe German vessels or something. But on the 12th of April, the British occupied the Faroe Islands, and therefore a German invasion was prevented. So it's often called a friendly occupation because they were very friendly. It was an occupation that, in a way, protected the Faroe Islands from something much worse. And therefore, which is unusual, the Faroe Islands have actually celebrated the occupation. It's an odd thing to do, to celebrate an occupation. But the soldiers who participated in the occupation in 1940 have been invited back to the Faroe Islands several times to celebrate this. And you can also see there are stamps from the Faroe Islands with British soldiers and Faroese children. But what this led to, of course, was a constitutional crisis, because after the war, the question was how should the relationship and the union with Denmark continue. For 5 years, there had been no connection with Denmark whatsoever. Denmark had been occupied by the Germans and the Faroe Islands by the British. So the debate in the Faroe Islands was whether to declare independence from Denmark, which Iceland had did in 1944, or to stay in some sort of union with Denmark. the politicians couldn't agree on anything. And they went to Denmark to negotiate, and in the end, the Danish authorities, the Danish government, they offered them a solution, later called the Danish proposal. And the the parties in the Faroe Islands could not agree on that proposal either, so they agreed on a referendum and sent it out to the people to decide. And they were given two opportunities, either to accept the Danish proposal or to accept a total separation from Denmark, independence. Very few people wanted the Danish proposal, and not so many wanted total independence. Most people, I think, wanted something in between. But they were not given that opportunity. So this was the result. There it was. Yes, which means yes to independence, 50.7%. No, 49.3%. Invalid votes, 4.1%. And 67.5% of the electorate participated. So a lot of people did not participate in this. Actually, if you count the votes, 32.9% of the Faroese population actively said yes to independence. So it was a difficult result to interpret. And the English historian John F. West called it a masterpiece of inconclusiveness. So if there was debate and undecidedness before the referendum, it was even worse afterwards. There was no agreement in the Faroese Parliament on what to do with this result. In the end, the King of Denmark, who had the authority to do it, dissolved the Faroese Parliament and decided that in the Faroe Islands, you should have new elections for the Parliament. And those elections were won by the parties who wanted a union with Denmark, some sort of union. They negotiated then again, and the result was the Home Rule Act of 1948. And according to that Home Rule Act, we are still, and it's still in force, and it's still defining, that Home Rule Act is still defining our relationship with Denmark and the Danish Kingdom. And according to that, we decide ourselves all internal matters, while external matters are to be dealt with by the Danish government. It has since been adjusted a little bit. There have been added some extra agreements and so forth, but basically that is still what is defining our relationship with Denmark and our place in the world, let's say. Then Faroese politics continued, and you can say that the Faroe Islands, they also benefited from the growth, the economic growth, and the prosperous years in the whole Nordic region after the war. So we also in the Faroe Islands began to build our own welfare state. I would like to show you this first. This is a result of that sort of inconclusiveness of the referendum. When we travel today, we can choose between two passports. The green on the left is the Faroese passport. So if you want to show your own distinctiveness, that you are Faroese, you use the green passport. On the other hand, you can also use the Danish passport, which is a European Union passport, and sometimes makes it easier to travel in Europe, especially if you work there. So a lot of people on the Faroe Islands use the Danish. Actually, more people use that one than the green one, but you can also have the green passport. So I think that's a very sort of in a very symbolic way actually shows our relationship to Denmark and the way that we think of our place in the world. It's sort of, and we are not a member of the European Union because of the fisheries. People under authorities on the Faroe Islands were afraid that Portuguese and Spanish and British trawlers and so forth will come into Faroese water if we are part of the European Union. So people at the referendum decided not to be a part of it. But on the other hand, if we, or I personally, choose to use a Danish passport, I can travel as a citizen of the European Union. So it's, yeah. The development after the war was a very traditional way of building a nation, with institutions that were required in a modern society, with an infrastructure that could support industries and so forth. And a peak in this nation building process was the establishment of the Faroese University in 1965. These are the first buildings, and today it's spread around Tórshavn. And there are about 1,000 students at the university. There are around 140 members of staff and all, if we count all of the members of staff. And as you can see, this is from the strategic plan, the newest strategic plan. There's another new coming now on the way. But it says, for instance, that the university, or we, leadership, or what else, always focus on our common purpose in being the university of and for the Faroe Islands. So there is a national romantic ideology that still is sort of defining a lot of the activities that are on the Faroe Islands, both politically, especially culturally. So it's a sort of a way of understanding our place and the way we are heading in the world. So that's where we are at the moment, and doing very well. Even though we have not decided on our relationship with Denmark, whether to be an independent nation or not. Some people prefer that doubleness, you might say, that we are both an independent nation culturally and in many other respects, but a part of the Danish kingdom and the European Union. And then this happens, the Arctic. Let me see. This is a new and very powerful regional construction, the Arctic. And I call it a construction because it's not only a question of geography, it's also a question of politics. The Arctic is something that has to do a lot with politics in the North. And when we discuss the Arctic, we discuss climate change, new sailing routes, minerals, military tension, and so forth. So this is a region of crisis. In many respects, it's a discourse. All the discourses connected to the Arctic are discourses of crisis. And there's a difference from that and the Nordic region and Scandinavia, which we associate with peace and harmony and prosperous countries and so forth. The Faroe Islands are considered by many to be stepping stones or a gateway to the Arctic. And to a certain extent, also, the political discussion in the Faroe Islands tends to make the Faroe Islands into stepping stones, because it's a lucrative place to be. If a lot of interest is coming from the outside to use the Faroe Islands as a stepping stone towards the north, for ships or for military purposes or other purposes, it could benefit, of course, the economic development of the islands. But there is a problem with that, and in the discussions about the Arctic, there is very little awareness of people, culture, and ordinary life in the region. It's only focused on matters of military or climate and so forth. And this, of course, has historical roots. If you look back into European history, you can see, for instance, ancient writers in old Greece or in Rome and so forth. They wrote about the north as an extreme zone of the earth. It was a place that was uninhabitable. There was snowy, there was wind, it was dangerous to be there. So, and actually you can see it in some of the discourses of today, that they are using some of the same images that were dominant 2,000 years ago. It's because we are using a concept as the Arctic instead of, for instance, Nordic, or we forget to say that the Arctic is actually a place where there are people and there is culture. I want to refer to a scholar here from the States. He was Palestinian of origin, Edward Said. You probably heard about him. he uses the concept, he actually coins the concept imaginative geography. And as you remember, Karen Ostlund used that in the description of the Faroe Islands in the beginning, when she said how travelers to the north conceived the Faroe Islands and Iceland, or the North Atlantic in general. The imaginative geography is a cultural narrative. It's based on texts and imaginings rather than facts. And Edward Said uses it to criticize the European scholars who wrote about the East. They were constructing the East based on their own preconceptions and desires rather than facts. And you can see that also taking place in other regions of the world. When people are writing about something they don't know, they tend to include imaginings as well as facts. So I will give you some examples here. This is just a few examples. Sabri Mamier was a very famous French writer in the 19th century. He's not that famous today, but he wrote a lot of books, novels, and travel writings, and a lot of different things in the 19th century. And this is from a travel account in 1844. He's leaving Norway and is sailing towards the north, and it says, "I was standing at one of the ends of the earth. In front of me was nothing but waves of the ocean and the ice of the pole, the sea without end, boundless, endless immensity." And then a more innocent example from a novel that you probably know, or some of you might know, Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre. This is the young protagonist, the young Jane Eyre. She's reading at the beginning of the novel in a book about birds. And it says, "I return to my book." And then she quotes, "Where the northern ocean and vast worlds boils round the naked melancholy eyes. Of these death-white realms I formed an idea of my own." So this is almost a description of an imaginative geography. She's reading something in a book, and then she's fantasizing about this place. The Canadian scholar Daniel Cartier has written a lot about this in a small book called What is the Imagined North? He writes in texts about the Arctic, there is generally a silencing of cultural and human aspects. So when we think of and talk about the Arctic, we tend to not think about people and culture. And there's a danger in that. Big, powerful nations of the world are making plans about the Arctic. Russia is interested, China is interested, France, Germany, and so forth. And of course, also the United States are interested. But what about the people who live there? So, a lot of the universities in the north are now cooperating in networks where they try to explore these new narratives, the new narratives about the north, and some call this an Arctification of the north. Arctification means that we are presenting the Arctic as a cold, desolate, and uninhabited region. So that is what the concept is describing. Leaving out people, leaving out everyday life. There are different national strategies. All countries today have an Arctic strategy. And if you look at them, culture is not in them. The French Minister of Security said in a strategic paper in 2019, the Arctic belongs to no one. There was also a statement from a French politician in that discussion who said that the Arctic may become the new Middle East because of all the minerals that are surfacing now because of the melting ice. So now minerals that are very valuable to to everyone, but also especially to the big powers of the world, are accessible. They were not accessible before, and this leads to new tensions in the region. But we also do this a little bit ourselves. In tourism marketing, for instance, we say that we are a region that is untouched or unplugged, undiscovered. And this also is something that we associate with at least sparsely populated areas where there is not much. So urbanization, we do not think society, we do not think culture and so forth. We think of nature and birds and sea and ice and so forth. This way of looking at the Arctic actually goes way back, and you can see some of what I mentioned, the old writers of the ancient Greece, for instance, who said that this was a place that was uninhabitable. They had a concept, the eukumene, which meant the inhabitable world. And they considered the north, especially the far north, to be the non-eukumene part of the world. So it's important for people who live far north to say, well, this is not uninhabitable. People are living here. Especially for people who live maybe north of the Faroe Islands, in the northern parts of Norway and Finland and Greenland and so forth. But the Faroe Islands are very much affected by this development. We are at 62 north latitude. I think the polar circle or Arctic circle is 66. So we are actually south of the Arctic circle, and we are not geographically a part of the Arctic, but politically we are. And when I go to work, for instance, I can sometimes see submarines out in the harbor in the Faroe Islands. Many of the travelers who came to the Faroe Islands 200 years ago, they came to watch birds. It was called a paradise of birds. There were a lot of birds on the Faroe Islands, and there still are. But today you can almost count submarines during the summer period. Of course, many of them, or all of those that we can see, are NATO vessels. But we don't know whether there are others in the area that we cannot see. So there is a growing military tension in the region. I want to quote from a new hero of mine. It's an American scholar, James Boyd White. He is a professor at the University of Michigan. He has written a lot about literature and law. And he's interested in the stories that law tells us. And here he says, for instance, about the way we are writing about others. My interest in what is at stake, intellectually, ethically, politically, when the human mind meets and tries to use languages that surround it, in the law and elsewhere, languages that are made by others, that are full of commitments to particular ways of imagining the world, describing it, judging it, and that carry deep within them the habits of mind, of values of the world in which they are made. So he wants to raise attention to the role of language and narratives in legal texts and in strategies, in international agreements and so forth. Which words, what kind of vocabulary are we using about different places in the world? And I also want to make, this is a little bit academic, but this is a Swedish scholar named Arne Mellberg, who made in a book from 2008, has a very useful distinction between mapping and meeting. When you write about a region or about people somewhere else, you can use a mapping strategy. That means you are classifying them, you are assigning fixed identities, you are creating an overview, you are efficient as a writer. Or you can move a little bit more slowly, hesitate, be self-conscious, slowing down, allowing yourself to meet people. And you can say that the example that I show you in the beginning about Jonathan Wiley, who went into the bookshop, looking for different signs, looking at the books, what are people writing here, what are they reading, and so forth, is a way of meeting a culture instead of only mapping it. And much of what is happening today in the discussions about the Arctic is mapping. It is not meeting. He also elaborates on this and says that when you travel and you are looking for sights, then you are looking for the spectacular, the superior, actually confirming your expectation. If you go to Egypt, you want to see the pyramids. If you go to New York, you want to go in the Empire State Building and so forth. To see is suspending your judgment and allowing yourself to actually discover an area slowly. This is, of course, I mentioned this here because I think what we need to focus on is more meeting in the Arctic region and less mapping. And I will return to that later. I think this is for the Faroe Islands as well, because we can gain a lot of importance internationally by saying that we are a stepping stone towards the Arctic. But that comes with a cost. The cost is that we are associated with narratives about empty places, desolate regions in the world. So we need to fill all the discourses about the Arctic with culture and people and everyday life. That is the challenge for our region in the future, as I see it. This is a picture of the only fortress in the Faroe Islands. It's built originally in the 1500s and then rebuilt in the 1700s, in the late 18th century. And you can see that today it looks almost like a piece of art. It's beautiful, and a lot of tourists, of course, are visiting it every summer. But that is also the only way that we can make ourselves, important in the world. Not by it has never ever played any significant role, an important role in the war, and it has never actually defended the Faroe Islands, but it was there. And it's more a piece of art actually than it is a military installation. And the only thing that we can do, as you can see from this overview of Faroese history, is that we are good at telling stories on the Faroe Islands. And it's also a very, active society when it comes to the arts in general, visual arts, theater, and so forth. And in a way, those are our tools to make ourselves heard in the world, rather than military installations. I want to show you this poem by a very well-known contemporary Faroese poet named Jonas Nilsen. It's called Bridges it's from a collection called Bridges of Hungry Words, and it's called Living Wasteland. It has something to do with geography and identity. Our desolate high mountains, identical to me, the eyebrow and knuckles, came into sight when the islands broke off at the base. I'm from the same vital material, as basalt, coal, red ochre. In my veins drizzle and bird blood, my skin stretched over the rocks. I love the emptiness that exhales off the scree. Everywhere the rind of grey and the greenish bark. Tarns tranquilize, moss campion and the gravel. In all directions, living wasteland. My home has always been here, the image of this jagged landscape in my cortex. I can't tell where my boundary ends and where the bedrock, shattered by frost and sun, begins. So it's a way of, identifying yourself with the place where you were from. But what is interesting, I think, is that he is not doing it in a traditional romantic way. Rather, he's identifying himself with the piece of geography, or almost geology, which is in the North Atlantic. And here we have, this is another, I'll showing some of these, which has something to do with gender and being raised as a female in the Faroes and so forth, and maybe a rather traditional community, which this is an example of, by Louis Maria Jäger. She is, she has actually studied philosophy, but she's also a poet, and this is from a sequence of poems by her. Text to Shame, it is called, Phenomenology 112. It comes after us again, the shame, dwells deeply buried in childhood before you understood what it was. It surfaces when we are adults and should have known better. Everything that has happened comes after us again. Great-grandmother in the Salvation Army, her diaries filled with prayer, sin and misfortune. The religious who understood that the body leads us astray. When grandmother stood on her hands as a child, and the skirts rolled down over her head, bare thighs and underpants. Grandmother shouted, "Shame on you," because the will of the body had to be tamed. We also get this from Schopenhauer, the obsolete idiot. I write, we carry shame in our sensuous body, we try to mix it with new ideas, but the ties. So you see, this is also a way of what you see regularly in Faroese literature, is a mixing of European mainland ideas and philosophy and the uniqueness of Faroe society and culture. There are published more than 200 books in the Faroe Islands each year. It's a lot. And Jonathan Wiley is still right, although his observation is from 1970. Most books are books of literature publications, or books about history. And these are from publications from a small publication or a publisher which is a little bit more progressive, tries to be a little bit experimental with his publications, and is quite successful in doing so, as you can see here. And then I want to end by making aware of the event tomorrow, when these excellent Faroese writers are visiting here and taking the stage. And I am with that, and thank you.
I have read of the recent exodus of many Faroese women and the influx of East Asian women at the invitation of Faroese men. Has there been any effort to try to stabilize the situation?
Yes, that has been an issue in Faroese society, that females either leave the country to live elsewhere, or they do not return when they are finished their studies in Copenhagen, for instance. While the men seem to return, at least more of them. And it may have something to do with traditional values in Faroese culture, and that there are more opportunities for men in Faroese society, or have been, than there are for women. The strengthening of the university is a way of trying to counter that by creating new kinds of jobs for educated women, well-educated women, so that they can return to Faroese society and get meaningful jobs. There has also been a lot of debate on equal rights and so forth. So it's something that is discussed constantly, and there are also political initiatives where they try to amend that. But it's right, and especially in some of the villages, we see a lot of women that are from Asia that are working and are married in the Faroe Islands. Yeah. So it's actually, we have a new program at our university, which is Faroese as a second language. It's quite a strange thing. We are 55,000 people, but we also need to teach some teachers how to teach Faroese as a second language, because there are so many people from the outside world now who do not speak Faroese as their mother, do not have it as their mother tongue. And also the tourist industry has also attracted a lot of people from elsewhere to work in the hotels and elsewhere. They come from different places in the world, and many of them come from Asia. And they do not speak Faroese, and they do not speak Danish either. So yeah, so that's a huge challenge in Faroe society at the moment. Yep.
Is abortion legal in Faroe?
No, it's not free abortion, no, and it's quite an intense discussion at the moment, because there is a proposal in the Faroese Parliament to have that abortion should be a free, or an option only for decision only for the female. So, and I think at the moment there is a majority for it, but let's see. Yeah. Yes.
If Denmark controls the external issues, what about, for instance, in the 200 nautical miles around the islands? If there are natural resources, the Faroe Islands control these resources, or Denmark?
The Faroe Islands actually do. I mean, the natural resources, which is the fish, for instance, that's completely up to the Faroese authorities. And according to agreement from the 1990s, the Faroese can also decide on minerals and other things that are in the bottom of the sea. But they are attached to some, because the Faroe Islands receive still a little bit of funding from the Danish state. So if the Faroe Islands are to find minerals in the bottom of the sea or the underground that are very valuable, they may be counter to the funding from Denmark each year. But according to agreements with the Danish authorities, the Faroe Islands can decide on that themselves. Yeah. Yes?
What percentage of the population speak Faroese? And is the percentage trending down because of the immigration that we're talking about? And related to that, how were you able to manage to keep your culture intact and the language intact? And I compare that to, for instance, Hawaii, where they've been anglicized and were unable to keep their language.
Yeah. The first question, I think we are still some 90 some, I don't have the precise number, but 90 some percentage of the Faroese population speaks Faroese. But a survey recently showed that there are almost 80 other languages in Faroese society, but these are very, very small communities, sometimes 5 or 6 people from somewhere who speak another language. And in South America, Eastern Europe, Asia, and so forth. The other thing, of course, what has saved or preserved the Faroese culture and language, of course, has been that it is an island community, far away, but Hawaii is as well. And then there are intense discussions about, and we have no agreements about that. Why is it that the Faroese language has survived? Why do we not speak Danish? Or when we are so close to the British Isles, as people on the Shetland Islands, for instance, why do we not speak English? Some people who are, you might say, idealistic, they would say that it is because of the national romantic movement in the 19th century, where people on the Faroe Islands discovered the vernacular culture and the language and were proud of it and identifying with it, and that sort of became a popular movement in the Faroe Islands, the preservation of the language. Others would say that it's also because of the Danish authorities who have been sort of far away from the Faroe Islands, and actually we didn't discuss much language until the 19th century and so forth. And Danish scholars were interested in Faroese in the 19th century. But there's also one important thing about the academic interest in the early 19th century in Faroese, is that the Faroe Islanders were involved in collecting the material. So it was not only scholars from the outside who visited the Faroe Islands and collected the material, the Faroe Islanders were participating, and I think that was important, because the Faroe Islanders from the beginning felt that they owned the national romantic movement. It was not just something that came from the outside. So I have not any sort of, you might say, clear explanation for that, but it has to, the Faroe Islands, until now at least, have succeeded in preserving their own language. But we are very much challenged at the moment by international media. A lot of the young people today are using more and more English vocabulary. And of course we have a growing number of Faroese citizens who do not speak Faroese. So it's a constant discussion in the Faroe Islands. You should also, of course, what I should mention also is that the Faroese government is making huge investments in the Faroese language and Faroese literature. So if you publish a Faroese book, you are supported by the Faroese government. There's funding for it. Faroese government is also funding the dictionaries of the Faroe Islands, and there's an internet website where you can go and you can see all the Faroese dictionaries into English and Danish and Italian and French and so forth. And it's free for all to use because it's publicly funded. And even you can also go in there and you can see all these dictionaries. So it's also a commitment from the political system in the Faroe Islands, I think, and that's very important. Yes?
You had said that the Faroes stayed out of the EU for reasons of the fishing industry and such. Is there many other countries who are fishing in the waters, or is it restricted? And sort of because I know the NATO is also involved, and I don't know if you're members of NATO or...
Yeah, we are. Yeah, we are members of NATO, yeah.
So how does all that tie together?
Well, there are other nations fishing in Faroe seas, but based on agreements so that the Faroe Islanders also fish in their seas. And it depends on which sort of fisheries it is. Of course, what has been very much disputed lately is that we still have an agreement with Russia, going back to the 1970s. They fish in Faroese waters, and the Faroe Islands then can fish in Russian waters, north of Russia. And that agreement is still in force. And there's a lot of political debate in the Faroe Islands whether that is right or not. And especially there has been discussions about whether these ships that are in Faroe seas only are fishing vessels, or they are a combination of fishing vessels and military vessels, and whether they are used for espionage and so forth. So, and I think at least Denmark would prefer that those agreements would not continue. But there is an internal arrangement between Denmark and the Faroe Islands that the Faroe Islands can make their own decisions on fisheries. So let's see how that turns out in the end. But there are foreign vessels in Faroese waters, yes. And with NATO, I mean, people on the Faroe Islands support the membership of NATO. And there are NATO installations on the Faroe Islands. I showed you the old fortress, but I could also have shown you some installations north of Tórshavn that are from the 60s and that are now being updated because of the tensions in the area. So NATO is visibly present in the Faroe Islands. But I think the relationship with Denmark is complicated because on the one hand, people on the Faroe Islands are fond of Denmark, and many people are studying there, and there are marriages across, Danish and Faroese marriages and so forth. But on a political level, there are constant debates. And the Faroese government is very critical when the Danish government makes some sort of agreement, for instance, in NATO or with the United States, and the Faroese authorities know nothing about it. So what they would say was, if you want to use the Faroe Islands as a stepping stone or for military installations or whatnot, then please use the front door so we can say welcome. Yeah. That was it. Yep.
What's your relationship with Iceland, which could be a model for coexisting with Denmark and existing in the Nordic seas?
Yeah. Of course, to many people on the Faroe Islands, Iceland is the ideal. They were a part of the Danish kingdom, and actually much of their history was similar to the Faroese history. They were also originally a part of the Norwegian kingdom, and then became part of the Danish kingdom. And then slowly they were, you could say, evolving, progressing towards independency, which happened in 1944. And they have also managed to preserve their own language, and language is very important to the Icelanders as well as the Faroe Islanders. So to many people, and we are very, very close contact with Iceland on many different levels, and especially when concerning cooperation within education, research, cultural issues, and so forth. But there are no economic ties, there are no sort of more political ties. There is a cooperation between Iceland, the Faroe Islands, and Greenland, and parts of Norway in the North Atlantic, which is called the West Nordic region. So there are very close contacts there, yes. Yeah. Yes?
Could you say a few words about your own work in Faroese literature and also about the network of Arcticulture history in the different regions?
Yes, well, I mean, I'm a very sort of traditional literary scholar. I've worked with poetry, especially poetry in the Nordic region. And as I mentioned to you, this is, scholars meet and they publish something together and so forth. My PhD was on travel writings, and I think that's the reason why I'm so much involved in the Arctic now, is because of the interest in travel writings from the past about the Nordic region, especially about the far north and the Arctic. And the network that I'm a part of about the Arctic is part of what's called the U-Arctic, which is U is university. So it's Arctic universities or universities close to the Arctic who are members there. And we have a network on culture and history in the Arctic region. So it's a way of countering all the narratives about military tensions and environmental crisis by saying, let's look at culture and history instead. So what we are doing there is that we have conferences and seminars and also a publications on tribal writings, culture, and arts in the Arctic region. Yeah, especially mostly that. And there's a congress in Norway in the end of May called Arctic Congress, the Arctic Congress, where there will be a lot of presentations from different regions in the North Atlantic, but also from elsewhere. And what is interesting is actually that France is very much interested in the Nordic region. I have a colleague in France who is very much interested in doing work on French expeditions to the north, and we have actually published a small paper together. Of course, they are interested because it's part of their history, but also suddenly it is relevant again to talk of French expeditions to the north. In a larger political context, it could also legitimize why the French are present in the Arctic today. They can say, yeah, well, we were there already 300 years ago. We were discovering this and that. So, of course, that is the difference between what you can call the Arctic discourse and the discourse about Scandinavia. There are so many different political and military implications in everything that has to do with the Arctic. So, but that is what we are doing there. Yeah. There is, of course, we have the same debates between industry and environmentalists and experts in the Faroe Islands on fishing. Sometimes we say that we do not have a sustainable fishing industry, or the fisheries around the Faroe Islands are not sustainable. But in parts, I think they are. They are quite well controlled now, but they were not before. We had a huge economic crisis in the 1990s, partly because of overfishing, but also because of the finance sector on the Faroe Islands. So I think we learned a lesson there, and there have been a lot of initiatives done in order to reach sustainability in the fishing. But you cannot say that it's sustainable at the moment. There's a little bit of overfishing. When it comes to salmon farming, we have at least one of the major companies there that is very much focused on sustainability, and the other one not so much. So they introduced a couple of months ago a new route. They are flying directly here to the States from the Faroe Islands to an airport somewhere here north of New York, but it's only with salmon. So they are exporting salmon directly from the Faroe Islands to the United States. But the other company, this is the one company, the biggest company, but there's another company which also is big, and they said this is not a sustainable solution. We should not export salmon with aeroplanes. So they are sailing their salmon instead. So the question you were asking is actually a discussion that is going on in Faroe society, and also between the companies in the Faroe Islands. But of course, people are afraid of what the salmon farming is doing to the fjords, to the waters around the islands, and to other kinds of industries that depend on the seas and the oceans around the Faroe Islands. So, yeah. Yeah.
What do people think about invasion of Russia in Ukraine, and the people and the government?
They think it's terrible. Yes, I think they all condemn it. The reason, and we have also quite many refugees from Ukraine and the Faroe Islands. The reason for the continuous cooperation with Russia on fishing, the agreements about fishing in Russian seas and so forth, are mostly based on the consequences that it might have for some communities on the Faroe Islands if those agreements are not withheld. So if we stop cooperating with Russia, what would that mean to that community in the north of the Faroe Islands, or that community there, and so forth? So those are speculations on how it would, which consequences it would have to certain communities on the Faroe Islands. I don't think it's not so much because people support Russia. I think there's a in the Faroese parliament, all the political parties have condemned it.
Do you need a visa to go to?
Russia, to
No,
Faroe Islands.
From the United States, do you need a visa?
I'm not sure. Do we?
No.
We
You
don't.
have a
We
consulate
have
here or no?
We are opening one in Washington within a couple of months or so.
You operate through Denmark or?
Yes, it's in cooperation with Denmark. We have actually, it's not embassies, but it's
Representation.
representations, offices that are connected to the Danish embassies in different countries. Yeah, mostly to take care of course, commerce and yeah.
Thank you.
Yes.
Urbanization, in this country, everybody's moving into the cities and it's causing housing shortages and such. Is there some of the same issues with the small villages and the outer islands?
Yes, there is. We have not had the same, you know, in Iceland. I think almost half or more of the population lives in Reykjavik. In the Faroe Islands, a lot of people have stayed in the villages until now. So, and there have been made huge investments in infrastructure just to preserve some small villages around the islands. But I think today around one third of the population lives in Tórshavn, the capital. So urbanization is going on, and the prices, you know, to live in Tórshavn, to get something to live in, a house or an apartment, are actually quite high. But people on the Faroe Islands are very much focused on the small villages. And I think it also has something to do with an island community. When there are 18 islands and not one, it's like an entire world, because each island has its own distinctiveness. And when concerning the Faroese language, each island has its own dialect. And even on some of the smaller islands, you can hear whether people live in that village or that village. So there are a lot of different dialects in the small language with 50,000 people speaking it. And so in the nation building process in the Faroe Islands, one thing was the welfare state and the modernization of the Faroese society, and the other thing was the preservation of the Faroese culture, meaning also the villages and the distinctiveness of the Faroese language. So there have been made huge investments in infrastructure so that people could live in small villages and maybe work in Tórshavn and drive back and forth and so forth. Yes?
Yeah, and related to that, can you talk about how much of the national financial resources is generated internally, and how much comes from, say, the national government or Denmark?
Yeah, I'm not quite sure whether I understand the question, and I think it would be difficult for me to answer that precisely. But of course, a lot of what if you think of the money circulating in Faroe society, comes from the industries in the Faroe Islands. And in some villages, if the fisheries are bad, you can always sense it immediately in the local store. People are buying less. But as we have built a welfare state, those effects are not that clear anymore as they were, let's say, 40 years ago. So people are helped by different systems in the public sector. So if you're unemployed, you get funding from the government, and if you are, for instance, if you want to study, you also get free support from the government and so forth. So there is also a lot of public funding in Faroe society. Yeah. I don't know who was first there. Yeah, I think it was you. Okay.
Can you talk a little bit about the role of religion in the Faroe Islands? You mentioned that it was Christianity was brought there, I guess, in the year 1000. But, I mean, in 2024, is Christianity still a predominant religion? Are a lot of people practicing? Is it incorporated into the education at all, or is it?
Well, it's definitely predominant still, yes. And especially in some parts of the Faroese society, religion plays a huge role to some people. And it also becomes part of the political debate sometimes. We have a political party that is based on, I don't know what you should call it in English, but the biblical truth about human beings and how society should be organized and so forth. So in some places in Faroese society, it really plays an important role still. In Tórshavn, maybe people are a bit more relaxed. It's urbanized, and you will even find people there who are not practicing any religion at all. But it's still, it's very visible also in Faroe society, and we have a lot of different sects. So we have the Lutheran Church, which is the official church of the Faroe Islands. It's also funded by the government, and that's where people get married and so forth. But we also have a lot of other churches and smaller religious communities, but they are, almost all of them are Christian. What we can see that we are Lutheran, but we can see now that there are more Catholics in the Faroe Islands now than before, and that's because of all the people coming from the Philippines and from eastern parts of Europe. But then, of course, we also have some people who are Buddhists and so forth, but that was not usual before. Yes?
Is there a public, organized public transportation? And how does that work?
Yes, there is a publicly funded transportation, bus and ferries and so forth. So yeah, it's quite cheap to travel actually in the Faroe Islands, and the buses in the capital of Tórshavn are completely free for everyone. So you can go on board and off and so forth. So yeah, there's a lot of public transportation. What we do not have are trains. The airport on the Faroe Islands was actually built by the British during the war. They needed an airport on the islands, so they built an airport there, and since that it has been, rebuilt and so forth. But it's still actually the same airport. And some people said that if we had a second occupation, maybe we would also have trains. But of course, the landscape makes trains difficult, and the distances are not that far. So people are also using a lot of cars. I mean, it's like Iceland, they have sort of a car culture, as they do in some parts of the States as well. So people on the Faroe Islands also tend to have their own car. But we have an excellent public transportation system, yes. Yes?
You showed the chart with the rising population earlier. How much of that is driven by immigration from people who want to work in the Faroe Islands, and how much is driven by maybe more people who go to Denmark who decide to return to the Faroe Islands?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, what we have experienced lately is that a larger part of the Faroese young people on the Faroe Islands who go abroad to study, because the Faroe Islands have always done that, even though we have a university today, a lot of the young people on the Faroe Islands study elsewhere. And a larger part of them are now returning because there is something to return to, and maybe also because the Faroe society is more modern and more open than it used to be. But the growth now is also absolutely has something to do with the people come from the outside who are working in the Faroe Islands. And of course it's a little bit vulnerable, because salmon farming, for instance, is very important, and if some sort of disease should spread around the salmon there in the Faroe Islands, it would mean that the economic growth will stop, at least in that very important industry. And that could have an effect on the rise in the population numbers right away. So some of that is absolutely due to the economic growth and people come to the Faroe Islands to work. We also have a fast track system, so that the Faroese industry can actually get people to work in the Faroe Islands without too much bureaucracy. But then they have to work, and if they do not work 40 hours per week, they have to leave the country again. So that's also a reason for the very high numbers we have at the moment. Yeah. Yes?
I just have a question. How do you reconcile the Arcticification of the Faroe Islands to what the tourism board kind of promotes? Because if you pick up the brochure, it says place undiscovered and kind of goes against to the very thing about sight versus the sea. So,
Yeah. It's but I mean, it's compared to many other places in the world, the Faroe Islands are undiscovered, of course, and they are. It's very short. I mean, if you are in the center of Torshavn, you can just walk some 100 meters and you are experiencing nature, or at least grass and sheep and so forth. So, and that's special. But the discourse is a little bit dangerous in a wider political context, because it signals that this is a place where there's not so much urbanization and maybe not so much human activity. And in that context, it can become dangerous. So we need to be careful with those brochures, yes. I think.
But I think we'll say good night for tonight. Thank you so much.
Thank you.